The wind on Aldris did not sound like wind on Earth. It moved through the frozen peaks in long, low notes, almost like something breathing far away. Snow fell sideways instead of down, pushed by gusts that rolled off the northern range in waves. The human colony sat far below those peaks, tucked into a valley where the air was warmer and the ground did not shake as much. But today, far to the north, the ground had shaken very much indeed. Owen felt the tremor through his boots before the alert reached his radio. He was checking a weather relay station on the border ridge, a routine job that usually took an hour and ended with him eating lunch alone while he watched the clouds. He had done this job for 2 years. He liked it because nobody bothered him and nothing ever went wrong. Today felt different. The quake had come from deep inside the Forbidden Peaks, the mountain range no human was allowed to enter. Every colonist knew the rule. It had been written into the treaty signed the day humans first landed on Aldris. The peaks belonged to the Skarn, the great winged people native to this world, and they belonged to no one else. Cross that line, and the fragile peace between two very different species could break for good. Owen checked his equipment and found something strange buried in the static of his relay signal. It was not a machine. It was not wind. It rose and fell in short bursts, almost like a heartbeat trying to speak. He had spent years as a combat medic before he ever came to Aldris, and something in his gut told him exactly what that sound meant. Something alive was in trouble. He called it in. Grant, the colony administrator, told him clearly to stay where he was and report the signal to the Skarn liaison office. That was the correct thing to do. It was also, Owen knew, going to take hours, maybe a full day, before anyone with real authority responded. By then, whatever was making that sound might already be gone. He looked north, toward the gray wall of mountains rising out of the mist. The treaty line was marked by a row of old beacons, half buried in snow, blinking red every few seconds like a warning heartbeat of its own. He had never crossed that line. No human had, not once, in all the years since the colony was founded. Owen was not a reckless man. He did not enjoy risk, and he was not the kind of person who broke rules for excitement. But there was something in him, something the years had never quite worn away, that could not walk past a sound like that and pretend he had not heard it. He had once left someone behind because a voice on a radio told him it was not his job to help. He had promised himself he would never do that again. He packed a medical kit, a thermal blanket, and a length of rope, and he walked past the beacons without looking back. The change was immediate. The wind grew sharper past the boundary, as if the mountain itself knew he did not belong there. The snow was deeper, the rocks sharper, and the silence pressed down on him in a way that made his own breathing sound too loud. He followed the broken signal higher into the peaks, past frozen waterfalls and narrow paths that had clearly not been touched by anything larger than a bird in a very long time. An hour in, he saw the first real sign that something enormous lived here. A single footprint, easily 3 times the length of his own boot, sat pressed into a patch of half-frozen mud. Claw marks stretched ahead of it, deep and confident. Owen had read every report on Skarn size and strength, the same reports every colonist studied before landing. Reading numbers on a screen was nothing like standing beside one of their footprints, alone, with no backup and no way to call for help if something went wrong. He kept moving anyway. The signal grew stronger the higher he climbed, and with it came another sound, a low groan of shifting rock, like the mountains settling after a long and uneasy sleep. He rounded a bend and found the source of the earlier tremor. A section of cliff face had collapsed, opening a jagged wound in the mountainside and swallowing whatever had once stood there. Water ran down into the gap in dark streams, and beneath the sound of that water, faint but unmistakable, came the cry he had been chasing for the last hour. It was not one voice. It was many voices, tangled together, small and frightened, and growing weaker by the minute. Owen stood at the edge of the broken cliff and looked down into the dark. He thought about the treaty, about Grant's voice on the radio telling him to wait, about every rule he had followed without question for 2 quiet years on this colony. Then he thought about the sound rising from below, and he stopped thinking about the rules at all. He tied off his rope, checked the anchor twice, and began to climb down into the Forbidden Peaks, toward whatever was waiting in the dark, alone, with no one on the entire planet knowing exactly where he had gone. The rope creaked under his weight as he lowered himself past broken slabs of stone still settling from the quake. Dust and loose gravel rained past him into the black. Twice, a rock gave way beneath his boot, and twice he caught himself against the cliff wall with his heart hammering in his chest. The cries below grew louder with every meter he descended, no longer a distant echo, but something close, something desperate, something that sounded almost like it knew he was coming. By the time his boots touched solid ground, the light from the surface above was nothing more than a pale gray coin far overhead. Owen switched on his headlamp, took one steadying breath, and turned to face whatever was waiting for him in the dark heart of the Forbidden Peaks. Water was already up to Owen's knees when his boots hit solid ground at the bottom of the rope. The air down here smelled of wet stone and something sharper underneath it, something that reminded him of old copper. His headlamp cut a narrow cone of light through the darkness, and in that light, he finally saw them. There were dozens of small shapes packed into a shrinking pocket of dry rock as water crept steadily closer. They were smaller than he expected, some no bigger than a large dog, their scales dark and slick with damp, their wings still folded tight against narrow ribs. Newborns, he realized, or close to it. Their guardians were nowhere in sight. Whatever adult Scarn had once watched over this nesting chamber, the collapse had either killed them, trapped them somewhere else, or driven them off entirely. The hatchlings shrieked when the light hit them, a chorus of high, panicked cries that bounced off the broken rock and doubled in his ears. Owen forced himself to stay calm. He had heard sounds like that before, in different mouths, on a different world, and he knew panic never saved anyone. He waited closer, and the nearest hatchling scrambled back as far as it could go, baring teeth far too sharp for something its size, wings raised in a warning it did not have the strength to back up. He held both hands open and low, the way he had once calmed frightened people pulled from wreckage, and he kept his voice steady even though he had no idea if the creature understood a single word. He said he was not going to hurt it. He said he was here to help. The hatchling did not stop shaking, but it also did not attack, and that was enough for Owen to take another step forward. The water was rising fast. Somewhere above, the quake had cracked open a hidden channel, and a slow flood was working its way into the chamber, filling the low ground first. If he did nothing, the smallest of the hatchlings, the ones too weak to climb onto the higher rocks, would drown within the hour. Owen did the only thing he knew how to do. He started working. He found the smallest one first, a thin, dark-scaled creature barely larger than a house cat, already half submerged and too exhausted to lift its own head above the surface. He scooped it up carefully, feeling the frantic hammer of its tiny heart against his palm, and carried it to a dry ledge above the waterline. It coughed up water, shivered violently, and pressed itself against his arm as if his body was the only warm thing left in the world. He would later come to think of this one differently from all the rest, though in that moment he had no time to think about anything except getting back into the water for the next one. He worked through the night. He lost count of how many trips he made between the flooding pool and the dry ledge, how many small bodies he lifted with arms that grew heavier and clumsier with every hour. His medical training kept him moving long after his muscles begged him to stop. He checked breathing where he could. He cleared blocked throats with fingers that shook from cold. He used his thermal blanket to warm the weakest ones first, then his own jacket, then finally just his own body heat, letting 3 or 4 of them huddle against him at once while he went back for more. Somewhere near the middle of the night, a support beam of rock gave way with a crack that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Owen threw himself sideways, dragging 2 hatchlings with him, as a slab of stone crashed down exactly where he had been standing seconds before. Dust filled the air. His ears rang. For a moment, he simply lay there in the freezing water, breathing hard, waiting to see if the ceiling would come down entirely. It did not. He got back up, because there were still more of them crying somewhere in the dark, and he had not come this far to stop now. By the time the water finally leveled off and stopped rising, Owen's hands were numb. His ribs ached from a fall he barely remembered, and his voice had gone hoarse from talking to creatures that could not answer him back. But every hatchling he had found was out of the water, arranged in small shivering clusters on the dry ledge, alive. He counted them twice to be sure. 41. 41 small lives that would have drowned in the dark if he had followed orders and stayed on the ridge, waiting for a report to move through the proper channels. He sat down heavily against the rock wall, too tired to feel proud of anything yet. And that was when he noticed the smallest one, the dark-scaled hatchling he had pulled from the water first, climbing unsteadily across the ledge toward him instead of staying with the others. It pressed itself against his side and did not move again. Owen was too exhausted to think much of it at the time. He assumed it was simply seeking warmth, the same as any cold and frightened creature would. He wrapped what was left of his blanket around the two of them and closed his eyes, meaning only to rest for a few minutes before checking the others one final time. When he opened his eyes again, pale gray light was filtering down through the broken cliff far above, and he was no longer alone with one hatchling. He was surrounded. Every single one of the 41 creatures he had pulled from the flood had gathered close around him in the night, some draped across his legs, some tucked beneath his arms, all of them watching him with wide, unblinking eyes the moment he stirred. Owen sat very still in the gray morning light, 41 pairs of eyes fixed on him, and slowly began to understand that something had happened here that he did not fully understand yet, and that walking away from it was not going to be as simple as climbing back up the rope alone. Owen had read, somewhere in one of the mandatory briefing packets every colonist skimmed and forgot, that Scarn hatchlings bonded early to whatever kept them alive in their first hours outside the egg. He had not paid much attention to that section at the time. It had seemed like a small, harmless fact about a species he was never supposed to get close enough to study. Sitting in a flooded stone chamber with 41 hatchlings pressed against him, he finally understood why that fact mattered. He tried, gently, to get up and put some distance between himself and the closest ones. He needed to check the ledge for any that had wandered, needed to look for a way out that did not involve dragging every single hatchling up a single rope one at a time. The moment he shifted his weight, the nearest hatchling let out a thin, panicked cry, and within seconds every other creature in the chamber picked up the same sound, until the whole space rang with a chorus of distress that hurt his ears, and, somehow, hurt something deeper than that too. He sat back down immediately, and the crying stopped almost as fast as it had started. Owen tried twice more, moving a little farther each time, and both times the reaction was the same. It was not simple attachment. It was something closer to panic, real and physical, the kind of fear that made small bodies shake and press closer together the instant he tried to leave. He remembered another line from that same briefing packet, one he now wished he had read more carefully. Scarn hatchlings, once bonded, could suffer real harm if separated too early from whatever they had imprinted on. It was meant to describe the bond between a hatchling and its birth guardian. Nothing in the packet had ever imagined a human filling that role by accident. He looked around the chamber at the small, exhausted, trusting faces watching his every move, and felt the full weight of what he had done settle onto his shoulders. He had come here to save them from drowning. Somewhere in the middle of that flooded night, without meaning to, he had also become the only thing in the world they now trusted enough to survive. There was no radio signal this deep in the mountain, and no way to call for help even if he wanted to. Waiting for an adult Scarn to arrive was not a real option either. Hours had already passed since the collapse, and if any guardians had survived the quake, they would have come by now. Owen was starting to suspect, with a cold feeling low in his stomach, that whatever had happened here had left every single one of these hatchlings without anyone else in the world to care for them. He spent the rest of the morning working out how to get 41 creatures up a rope built for one grown man. In the end, he did not use the rope at all. Farther along the collapsed chamber, past a curtain of hanging roots and broken stone, he found a wider crack that led in real daylight, a natural path carved by the same quake that had nearly killed them all. It was steep and slick with mud, but walkable, if barely. He led them out of the chamber in a slow, uneven line, the strongest hatchlings first, the weakest ones carried in his arms or riding, awkwardly and against every instinct he had, across his shoulders. The dark-scaled one that had found him first stayed closest of all, never more than a step behind his heel, watching every move he made as though the rest of the world might vanish if it looked away too long. The climb up through the crack took most of the day. Owen's legs burned, his ribs ached with every breath, and more than once a hatchling slipped on the wet stone and had to be caught before it fell. He kept moving anyway, because stopping now meant stopping in the open with no shelter, and no way to protect 41 exhausted creatures through another cold night in the peaks. When they finally broke out into open air, the sun was already low over the western ridge, painting the snow in long orange light. Owen stood at the mouth of the crack, breathing hard, and looked out over the very treaty line he had crossed the day before. From up here, the beacons looked small and fragile, blinking red against the growing dusk, marking a border that had never once, in all the years of the colony, been crossed the way he was about to cross it now. Behind him, 41 hatchlings shuffled and stretched their cramped wings in the cold air, none of them straying more than a few steps from where he stood. He understood, standing there, that he had two choices left, and neither of them was simple. He could try to leave the hatchlings somewhere near the border and hope some Scarn patrol found them before the cold or a predator did. Or he could bring them the rest of the way down himself, straight into the middle of a human colony that had no idea any of this had happened, and straight through a treaty line that had never once been broken in either direction. He looked down at the small dark-scaled hatchling pressed against his leg, and thought about the way it had cried the instant he tried to walk away from it in the flooded chamber. He thought about the panic in 40 other voices doing exactly the same thing. Owen picked up his pack, checked the fading light one more time, and started down the mountain, 41 Dragonlings falling into an uneven, determined line behind him, following the only warmth and steady heartbeat any of them had ever known. The Border Patrol officer who first spotted them nearly dropped her binoculars. She had been watching the northern ridge for 2 years, mostly logging weather patterns and the occasional distant shape of a Scarn flying too high to identify. She had never once seen a human coming down from the Forbidden Peaks, and she had certainly never expected to see one leading what looked, from that distance, like an entire migrating herd of small dragons behind him. She called it in immediately, her voice cracking halfway through the report. Within minutes, the message had traveled from the border post to the main comm room, and from there straight to Grant's desk, interrupting a budget meeting he had been trying to end for the last 20 minutes anyway. Grant read the message twice before he fully believed it. A colonist, alone, walking down from the restricted zone. Dozens of juvenile Scarn following close behind him, showing no signs of aggression, moving in an orderly line like they were being led. He set down his tablet, told the room the meeting was over, and walked to the window overlooking the northern approach road with a feeling in his chest he did not have a name for yet. By the time Owen reached the outer checkpoint, half the colony had already gathered along the perimeter fence to watch. Word traveled fast in a settlement this size, and nothing traveled faster than the words dragons and Forbidden Peaks used in the same sentence. Owen walked through the gate looking like a man who had not slept properly in 2 days, mud dried into his clothes, a thin scratch healing along one cheek, and 41 hatchlings trailing behind him in a line that had not broken once since the mountain. Nadia reached him before Grant did. She was the colony's junior xenobiologist, young enough that most of the senior staff still underestimated her, and she had been arguing for years that the treaty's strict separation between the species was based on fear rather than real understanding. She took one look at the hatchlings, one look at Owen's exhausted face, and immediately started asking questions faster than he had the energy to answer. Grant arrived moments later, flanked by 2 security officers who clearly had no idea what protocol applied to a situation like this, because no protocol existed. He did not shout, which Owen appreciated given how close he was to simply sitting down on the ground and not getting up again. Instead, Grant asked, in a low and very careful voice, exactly what Owen thought he was doing. Owen told him everything. The tremor, the signal, the flooded chamber, and the 41 small lives that would not have survived another hour without help. He explained, as clearly as his exhausted mind allowed, that he had tried to leave them, more than once, and that every attempt had ended the same way, with hatchlings crying in real, physical distress the moment he tried to walk away. Nadia knelt down slowly near the edge of the group, moving with the same care Owen had learned to use, and confirmed within minutes what he already suspected. This was not simple attachment. It was full biological imprinting, the kind described only briefly in old Scarn research notes. Notes written by scientists who had never actually witnessed it happen, because no human had ever been close enough to a hatchling at the right moment for it to occur. The news spread through the colony faster than Grant could control it. By evening, Security had been forced to set up a perimeter simply to keep curious colonists back from the small crowd of Dragonlings now resting, uneasily, in a supply yard near the main gate. Some colonists were amazed. Others were afraid. A few, loudly and repeatedly, pointed out that this was exactly the kind of incident the treaty had been written to prevent in the first place. The Skarn response came faster than anyone expected. Just after dark, 3 enormous shapes descended out of the low clouds and landed heavily outside the perimeter fence, wings folding with a sound like distant thunder. At the center of them stood the largest Skarn Owen had ever seen up close, scales the color of old iron, a long scar running down one side of its jaw. This was Ridgeback, eldest warden of the northern peaks, and the Skarn most directly responsible for guarding the very border Owen had crossed 2 days earlier. Ridgeback did not roar, or attack, or do any of the things half the frightened colonists watching from a distance seemed to expect. The warden simply looked past the fence, past Grant, past the security officers standing awkwardly with weapons they clearly did not want to use, straight at the cluster of hatchlings gathered around Owen's feet. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then Ridgeback spoke, in the deep, resonant tone the colony's translation devices struggled to fully capture, and the words that came through were simple and cold. The hatchlings belonged to the Skarn. They would be returned tonight, or the treaty between their peoples would be considered broken by human hands, for the second time in 2 days. Owen looked down at the small dark-scaled hatchling pressed against his leg, trembling now not from cold, but from the sheer size and presence of the warden beyond the fence, and he understood that nothing about the next few hours was going to be simple. Grant, standing beside him, spoke quietly enough that only Owen could hear. He said they had until morning to find some answer that satisfied everyone, or the colony would be facing a crisis far larger than 1 exhausted man and 41 frightened hatchlings. Neither of them had any idea, yet, what kind of answer that could possibly be. No one in the colony slept much that night. Floodlights lit the supply yard where the hatchlings rested in uneasy clusters, and beyond the fence, the 3 Skarn wardens did not move, did not leave, and did not stop watching. Security officers walked the perimeter with weapons they had been told firmly not to use unless directly ordered, and colonists who should have gone home hours ago still lingered near their windows, watching the standoff play out under the harsh white light. Owen sat on an overturned crate near the hatchlings, too wound up to rest, even though his body had been begging for sleep since before he ever reached the checkpoint. Nadia had brought him food he barely touched and water he drank without noticing. Grant had gone back and forth between the fence and the comm room a dozen times, trying to reach colony leadership on the other side of the planet, trying to find some official policy that covered a situation nobody had ever imagined needing a policy for. Just before midnight, Owen made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood up, told Nadia to stay with the hatchlings, and walked toward the fence alone. Grant tried to stop him. He said this was exactly the kind of move that could get someone killed, that negotiations like this were supposed to happen through proper channels, through translators and officials and years of careful diplomatic training, not through one exhausted survey worker walking up to an angry warden in the middle of the night. Owen told him, quietly, that proper channels had already had 2 days to solve this, and the hatchlings did not have 2 more days left in them if this standoff dragged on. He walked to the fence and asked, through the small translation device clipped to his collar, to speak with Ridgeback directly. The warden's eyes, large and gold and unreadable, fixed on him the moment he spoke. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of settling wings, Ridgeback stepped closer to the fence, close enough that Owen had to tilt his head back to hold the creature's gaze, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off scales that had clearly seen more than one real battle in their lifetime. Owen did not try to argue about the treaty, or about ownership, or about whose rules had technically been broken first. He simply told Ridgeback exactly what had happened, in plain and simple words, the same way he would report an incident to any commanding officer back when he still wore a different kind of uniform. The quake, the flooded chamber, the 41 hatchlings he had found alone, without a single adult guardian anywhere nearby. The hours spent pulling them out of rising water one at a time, not knowing if help was coming, not knowing if anyone was even looking for them at all. Ridgeback's expression, if it could be called that, shifted at the mention of the missing guardians. The warden asked, in a voice noticeably less steady than before, whether Owen was certain no adult Scarn had reached the chamber before him. Owen said he was certain. He had searched every corner of that flooded space before deciding to bring the hatchlings out himself, and he had found no sign of any adult, alive or otherwise, anywhere near the nesting site. For the first time since landing outside the fence, Ridgeback looked away from him, toward the dark shape of the mountains rising beyond the colony lights. When the warden spoke again, the anger in that deep voice had changed into something closer to grief. There had been Scarn guardians assigned to that chamber, Ridgeback admitted. They had not been seen since the quake struck. It was possible, even likely, that they had been lost in the same collapse that trapped the hatchlings, unable to reach their own young in time. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Owen began to wonder if he had made things worse rather than better. Then the smallest hatchling, the dark-scaled one that had never strayed far from his side since that first night in the flooded chamber, pushed its way through a gap in the fence and climbed, unsteadily but with clear determination, up onto Owen's shoulder, curling its small body against his neck the way it always did when frightened. Ridgeback watched this happen without moving, without speaking, for a long moment. Finally, the warden said something the treaty had never once accounted for in all the years since it was signed. Imprinting, once formed, could not be forced by any Scarn, and could not be undone by any known method, not gently, not without real and lasting harm to the hatchling involved. Punishing Owen for what had happened would mean punishing 41 already frightened young for a bond none of them had chosen and none of them could break. Ridgeback did not sound pleased about this conclusion. The warden sounded, more than anything, tired and older than Owen had realized, standing there in the harsh light with the weight of lost guardians and an impossible new problem settling over those iron-colored scales. After a long silence, Ridgeback said the treaty as it stood had clearly never imagined a night like this one, and that perhaps it was time the Scarn and the humans stopped pretending old rules could answer new questions. The warden proposed something no agreement between their peoples had ever allowed before, something that would need to be carried back to the other wardens and argued over for days before any final answer came. Owen, standing at the fence with a small dragon curled against his neck and no idea what the coming days would bring, found himself agreeing before he had even fully heard the proposal. 3 weeks passed before the new agreement was finally signed, and in that time, the small dark-scaled hatchling that had first climbed onto Owen's shoulder at the fence had already grown noticeably heavier. Owen had started calling it Soot, mostly because nothing else fit a creature that dark, and the name had stuck fast enough that even Ridgeback had started using it during the long, careful negotiations that followed that first tense night at the border. The talks were not easy. Scarn wardens from across the northern peaks argued for days over what it meant to let a human take any role at all in raising Scarn young, even young that biology itself had already bonded to him. Colony leadership argued just as hard on the other side, worried about the treaty's original purpose, worried about setting a precedent no one fully understood the consequences of yet. Grant spent more hours in translated meetings during those 3 weeks than he had in his previous 2 years running the colony combined. In the end, the agreement that emerged looked nothing like the old treaty and nothing like anyone had expected going in. Owen was granted supervised access to a section of the lower peaks, close enough to the border that both sides could monitor it easily, where the 41 hatchlings would be raised jointly by Scarn caretakers and, for the first time in the colony's history, a single trusted human. It was not full access to the Forbidden Peaks. It was not the free and equal partnership some hopeful colonists had already started talking about in the days after the standoff. But it was something entirely new, built specifically around a bond neither species had believed was possible before that night. Owen spent most mornings after that in the shared nursery grounds, and it did not take long for the arrangement to prove itself worth the risk both sides had taken. The hatchlings, freed from the fear and confusion of those first uncertain weeks, grew stronger and steadier with each passing day. Soot in particular seemed determined to make up for lost time, following Owen everywhere the fence line allowed, and more than once placing itself directly between him and any Scarn caretaker who approached too quickly, wings half raised in a small, fierce warning that made even Ridgeback's stern expression soften slightly whenever it happened. Ridgeback visited often, more often, Nadia pointed out privately, than the treaty technically required. The old warden had been distant and formal in those first meetings, clearly still uneasy about the entire arrangement. But watching the hatchlings thrive under a partnership no Skarn had ever attempted before seemed to wear away at that distance a little more with each visit. One afternoon, Owen found Ridgeback simply sitting near the edge of the nursery grounds, watching the hatchlings play in the thin mountain sunlight, and the warden admitted, in a low voice that did not carry far, that the Skarn had always assumed devotion like this belonged only to their own kind. Watching a human hold that same devotion for creatures not his own by blood had forced Ridgeback to reconsider a great many assumptions built up over generations. Word of the arrangement spread slowly at first, then faster, through both the colony and the wider Skarn territories beyond the peaks. Other colonists, inspired by what Owen had done, began working more closely with Skarn caretakers in different roles, tending injured wildlife together, sharing survey data that had once been kept strictly separate, building small, careful bridges between two peoples who had spent years living side by side while barely understanding each other at all. None of the new bonds that followed were quite like the one between Owen and his 41 hatchlings, but each one chipped away, a little more, at a wall that had stood since the very first day the colony was founded. Grant, watching all of this unfold from his office window months later, admitted to Nadia one evening that he had spent that first chaotic night convinced Owen's decision would end in disaster for everyone involved. Instead, it had opened a door neither species had thought to look for, simply because one tired man had refused to walk away from a sound crying out for help in the dark. By the time the first snows of the following winter reached the lower peaks, soot had grown large enough to carry Owen a short distance through the air, an experience that left him equal parts terrified and unable to stop grinning for the rest of that day. The other 40 hatchlings had grown just as quickly, each developing their own small habits and personalities, each still returning to Owen's side whenever the world around them felt uncertain, even as their bonds with their Skarn caretakers grew stronger too. Standing at the edge of the border one clear morning, no longer forbidden to him, Owen watched soot circle lazily overhead while the rest of the clutch explored the rocky slopes nearby under Ridgeback's watchful eye. The old warden approached and stood beside him in comfortable silence for a while before speaking. Ridgeback said quietly that the mountains had kept humans out for a very long reason, and that reason had never once been questioned until the night Owen walked down out of the forbidden peaks with 41 Dragonlings following behind him. Perhaps, the warden added, some walls were only ever meant to stand until someone finally proved they no longer needed to. Owen said nothing in reply. He simply watched soot dive low over the ridge with a sharp, joyful cry, and felt, for the first time since that first tremor beneath his boots, that he had done exactly the right thing.